The year was 1936. Clouds hung low over the highlands of Ethiopia, and beneath them, an ancient empire was being tested by the engines of modern war. Italy had returned to Africa. 40 years earlier, Mussolini's predecessors had been humiliated at Adwa, a small mountain town where Ethiopian warriors shattered a European army and forced the world to acknowledge an African victory. To fascist Italy, that defeat was a wound that never healed. Mussolini promised to avenge it, to prove that modern machines could conquer where men had once failed. When the invasion began in 1935, Italian bombers filled the sky above Tigray and Wollo. The whine of their engines echoed through valleys that had known only drums and church bells. Villages were bombed, markets burned, and mustard gas drifted across open fields. For the first time in its history, Ethiopia faced an enemy that attacked not from the mountains, but from the clouds. The imperial army fought bravely, but was outmatched. Rifles met tanks, spears met aircraft, and by May 1936, the Italian tricolor flew over Addis Ababa. The Emperor Haile Selassie left for exile, vowing to return. Officially, Ethiopia had fallen. Unofficially, it was only beginning to fight. Across the highlands, in ravines and caves, scattered soldiers refused to surrender. They called themselves Arbegnok, patriots. Farmers by day, fighters by night, they waged a war of ambushes, sabotage, and whispers. Italy could occupy cities, but it could not occupy the spirit of the countryside. By 1937, the Patriot ranks had swelled to nearly 12,000 men and women. They lacked rifles, uniforms, and above all, protection from the air. The Italian Air Force, Regia Aeronautica, ruled the skies. Its reconnaissance planes flew daily, mapping rebel hideouts, bombing gatherings, and cutting off supply routes before they formed. Every time the Arbegnok tried to assemble in large numbers, Italian pilots would appear within hours. To fight the invader, they first had to fight his eyes. In the northern mountains near Lake Tana, one patriot leader, a former soldier named Abebe Aregai, began to notice a pattern. The Italians bombed where they believed anti-aircraft guns existed. Any sight of an artillery barrel, any glint of metal drew their attention. He realized the air war was not just about strength, but about perception. What if perception could be turned against them? The Patriots had no real artillery. The few captured guns they possessed had long since broken, their shells spent, but they had carpenters, hunters, and horsemen who understood the shapes of weapons as well as they understood the shapes of trees. Aragai gathered them and proposed something audacious: to build an army of ghosts, anti-aircraft guns carved from wood, positioned on hillsides where spies and pilots could see them. At first, the idea sounded absurd. How could a piece of timber fight an airplane? But the guerrillas had learned that in war, imagination could wound as deeply as steel. Throughout the highlands, men began feeling eucalyptus trees, tall, straight trunks, perfect for sculpting. In ravines, they carved barrels, shaped them with knives and machetes, and blackened the wood with soot to mimic burned metal. Old oil drums were cut open to form imitation shields. From a distance, the silhouettes looked convincing, especially through the distorted lens of an aircraft windows. Each fake gun took a day to make and another to install. They were mounted on rock piles, surrounded by empty crates to resemble ammunition boxes. Some were even covered with camouflage netting woven from grass. Children helped paint them with mud to add texture. By the time the first Italian reconnaissance planes circled overhead, entire ridgelines glittered with what looked like freshly deployed artillery. Reports flooded back to Italian command posts. Enemy possesses heavy anti-aircraft concentrations north of Lake Tana. The pilots were certain. The shapes were clear. They had seen the shadows with their own eyes. To the Italians, the discovery was alarming. Their bombers were vulnerable at low altitude. A single real gun could bring one down. Yet intelligence had failed to predict any such capability among the Ethiopians. Commanders argued over how the Patriots had obtained modern weapons, perhaps from the British, perhaps smuggled from Sudan. Caution replaced confidence. Flights that once strafed valleys freely now climbed higher, dropping bombs from altitudes too great for accuracy. Italian mechanics added armor plates to planes that had never needed them before. The Regia Aeronautica began losing its precision, not because of damage, but because of doubt. And in the highlands below, the Patriots moved more freely than they had in months. Villages rebuilt under the cover of imaginary guns. Supply lines reopened. A deception had bought them time, the most precious resource in any war. By midsummer 1937, the trick had spread across multiple provinces. Each local commander added his own creativity. Some built fake trenches filled with straw soldiers. Others used broken mortars to simulate glints of gun barrels. The wooden artillery pieces became part of Ethiopia's landscape, standing sentinel over valleys like guardians carved from the earth itself. Italian pilots soon developed superstitions. They claimed the Ethiopians could summon guns from the ground overnight. Some said the mountains themselves were armed. It was an empire haunted by illusions of its own making. In headquarters, the Italians debated whether to deploy elite engineers to locate and destroy these supposed batteries. Whole squadrons were redirected to bomb empty ridges, wasting fuel and munitions on shadows. Propaganda photographers took pictures of destroyed enemy artillery positions, unaware that their trophies were made of timber. Each explosion that shattered a fake gun saved a real village. The success of the deception was not measured in numbers of planes shot down. There were none, but in sorties aborted, in hours of safety gained. The wooden guns changed behavior. They forced a modern air force to fear ghosts. By late 1938, the Patriots were bold enough to assemble in groups again. Ambushes increased along Italian supply lines. The air raids that once broke their momentum grew sporadic and hesitant. When the Second World War erupted in Europe a year later, Italy's focus shifted. Its exhausted colonial forces struggled to maintain control, and by 1941, British and Ethiopian units liberated the country. Many historians would later say the deception played only a small part in that outcome. But for those who lived under the wooden guns, it meant survival. It proved that imagination could tilt even the balance of empires. As 1937 turned to 1938, the Italian occupation of Ethiopia began to change shape. The early triumphs, the victory parades, the pomp of empire, all of it had begun to fade beneath the dust of resistance. In the mountains, the Patriots were no longer fugitives. They had learned how to disappear and reappear like wind over the hills. They attacked convoys, cut telephone lines, ambushed isolated garrisons, and melted back into the countryside before aircraft could respond. But perhaps their greatest weapon was the illusion that they possessed weapons at all. The first reports of the wooden guns had been dismissed as isolated mistakes by overcautious pilots. Then came more. Aerial photographs showed dozens of anti-aircraft positions across the islands. The photographs were shown to Italian generals in Addis Ababa. Hard evidence, it seemed, that the Ethiopian rebels were growing stronger. The maps of supposed artillery placements spread across command tables. Red circles marked imaginary guns that had never fired a shot. To verify the intelligence, the Italians began sending ground patrols into the hills to locate these hidden batteries. Many never returned. They were ambushed by patriots who knew every fold of the land. From then on, reconnaissance became a thing of fear. The deception had evolved into a strategy. By early 1938, the Abegnok were using wooden guns to shape enemy movement. They built them near ravines they wanted to protect, on slopes leading to villages, and along trails that connected their food sources. Each fake emplacement served as both shield and signpost, a silent deterrent that redirected the enemy without firing a bullet. The Italian High Command grew paranoid. Orders came down that no aircraft was to fly lower than 3,000 meters over suspected anti-aircraft zones. The result was catastrophic for accuracy. Bombs meant for Patriot camps often fell miles away, destroying empty fields or even Italian outposts. Mechanics complained that aircraft were wearing out faster because of the stress of high-altitude flight. Crews grew tense. Pilots began to distrust their own eyes. Every dark line in the soil, every stack of rocks could be a gun. The wooden army had spread not only across the mountains, but into the minds of those who ruled them. Ethiopian carpenters took pride in their creations. In the village of Debre Marcos, a craftsman named Wolde Mariam became famous among the patriots for his works of art. He would carve entire batteries of guns, complete with wooden shells stacked beside them. Some were even jointed, able to elevate when pulled by ropes. When the Patriots placed one of Wolde Mariam's creations on a hill, Italian pilots would note it instantly. New anti-aircraft gun spotted, and call for a strike. Hours later, the fake weapon would be reduced to splinters, and the villagers below would laugh quietly, knowing the ruse had worked again. The deception became ritual. Each time the Italians destroyed a fake gun, another would rise elsewhere. Children competed to spot the next location. The Patriots had turned survival into an art form, a theater of shadows played out on the mountainsides. The Regia Aeronautica relied heavily on photographs, but the combination of Ethiopia's thin air, its shimmering heat, and its rugged terrain made aerial interpretation difficult. Italian analysts in Addis Ababa pored over grainy prints that showed dots and lines, convincing themselves they saw the barrels of heavy guns. One officer later wrote in his diary, "We feared the mountains themselves had sprouted weapons. The more they believed, the more resources they wasted trying to counter them." Convoys hauled anti-aircraft artillery hundreds of kilometers from the capital to neutralize threats that did not exist. Airfields were shifted, supply routes rerouted. Every movement stretched Italy's logistics thinner across a hostile land. Meanwhile, the Patriots gained freedom to regroup. Under cover of illusion, they held councils, distributed food, and even published underground leaflets calling for unity against the occupiers. In villages where fear had once ruled, laughter returned. The laughter of people who knew something their conquerors did not. In Rome, Mussolini demanded results. He had promised his people an empire as radiant as the Italian sun. Yet reports from Ethiopia were filled with vague mentions of native insurgency and unreliable intelligence. To save face, the colonial administration exaggerated its successes. Newspapers printed photos of captured wooden guns, presenting them as proof of victory, evidence that Italy had destroyed the enemy's anti-aircraft defenses. Ironically, those photographs became the best evidence of the deception's success. Even in triumph, Italy confirmed it had been fooled. The contradiction was embarrassing. Among officers stationed in Addis Ababa, jokes began to circulate. Our enemies are farmers with trees, yet they fight with forests. But behind the humor was a growing unease. They could never be sure what was real. Even the sound of distant thunder made pilots nervous. Was it weather or artillery? The Ethiopians had done something rare in warfare. They had turned superstition into strategy. The success of the wooden guns owed much to Ethiopia's geography. The country's jagged highlands created natural strongholds where shadows played tricks on the eye. A fake gun placed against the skyline could appear life-sized to an observer miles away. Sunlight, reflecting off a stream, might mimic the flash of metal. Even goats, grazing near a position, could be mistaken for camouflage movements. The Patriots understood these illusions instinctively. They lived inside the terrain. The Italians only flew over it, and so the land itself became part of the deception, a silent ally in the guerrilla's war of patience. Every tree was potential cover, every hill a potential battery. The wooden guns were not just props. They were an extension of the landscape, expressions of an ancient truth, that the earth can protect its own when its people know how to listen. As months passed, the idea spread beyond Abebe Arigai's group. Messengers carried news of the trick from province to province, disguised as traders and monks. Soon, patriots in Shoa, Gojam, and Begemda were building their own versions. Some made them crude and simple, others elaborate, with wooden cranks and fake wires running to imaginary power sources. There was no central command. The deception spread organically. Like folklore, it became a story that inspired as much as it fooled. A reminder that intelligence and courage were the only weapons truly beyond the enemy's reach. Even in areas where no wooden guns existed, Italian soldiers swore they saw them. The illusion had transcended the material. It lived in rumor. By 1939, the occupation was bleeding resources. What had been expected to be a quick victory now required constant garrisoning and endless patrols. Italian morale dipped. The vast technological gap that had promised easy conquest had instead bred uncertainty. Pilots flew higher, soldiers marched slower, and commanders trusted their maps less with each passing month. The Patriots' greatest achievement was not the destruction of machines, but the corruption of confidence. Italy had entered Ethiopia to prove the supremacy of modern warfare. It left haunted by wooden ghosts. When the Second World War broke out and Italy joined Germany, the Ethiopian front was already fragile. Within 2 years, British Commonwealth forces and exiled Ethiopians swept through the highlands and drove the occupiers out. The empire that Mussolini had promised to last for generations vanished in weeks. And though historians would credit many causes, logistics, overextension, Allied intervention, the roots of Italy's weakness had been planted earlier in those wooden shapes carved by shepherds and carpenters on the hillsides that refused to surrender. When the Italians finally withdrew from Ethiopia in 1941, the wooden guns were left behind, scattered across ridges, half-burned or rotting, their dark paint fading back into the earth. To the villagers who found them, they were relics of resistance, symbols of a time when wit outshone weapons. Many were taken apart for firewood, their ashes warming the same homes that had once crouched beneath Italian bombs. But their story endured. It lived in the memories of those who had carved them, in the tales told by grandfathers to children sitting by candlelight. We fooled the plains, they would say. We fought with shadows, and the shadows won. In the quiet aftermath of war, historians struggled to grasp what had happened. The official records of Mussolini's empire rarely mention defeat, yet within reports and correspondence lay small admissions, lines written by officers who knew they had been deceived. One read simply, "The natives possess more guns than God intended." It was meant sarcastically, but in hindsight, it captured the truth. Ethiopia had manufactured a new kind of weapon, belief itself. Decades later, military analysts would revisit the campaign and realize what those wooden guns truly represented. They were not just decoys. They were a form of psychological warfare long before the term existed. They exploited the most fragile part of any army, not its supply lines or its machines, but its perception of reality. Modern strategists call it perception dominance, when one side controls not the battlefield, but the enemy's understanding of it. In the 1930s, a handful of Ethiopian carpenters and guerrilla leaders had achieved exactly that, using nothing more than timber, soot, and patience. It is one of history's earliest and purest examples of asymmetric warfare. The weak shaping the actions of the strong without matching their firepower. And this idea that fear, if carefully guided, can be more powerful than steel, would later echo through wars across the world. From inflatable tanks used by Allied forces in World War II to decoy airfields and phantom divisions, all of them owed something to lessons first learned in the highlands of Ethiopia. Behind the strategy were ordinary men and women. Few of their names were recorded, yet they were the heart of the deception. Farmers who carved the barrels by night, shepherd boys who carried the parts on muleback to hilltops, mothers who spread rumors in markets so Italian spies would overhear them. Each act, however small, added another thread to the web of illusion. They understood instinctively that war was not only fought with bullets, but with imagination. They turned necessity into creativity, a trait as old as humanity itself. In villages like Gojam and Shoa, elders still recall how the wooden guns became part of the landscape. Children used to play around them, pretending to shoot at the sky, unaware that their games echoed a real battle fought through deception. When Emperor Haile Selassie returned to Addis Ababa in May 1941, the crowds filled the streets with song. Flags waved, bells rang, and for the first time in 5 years, Ethiopia was free. The emperor knew the victory had not been his alone. It had belonged to those who had fought without uniforms, those who had survived by wit rather than weapon. In one of his early addresses, he said, "Our mountains hid not only our bodies, but our faith." The enemy saw what we wished him to see, and what he saw destroyed him. Though he never mentioned the wooden guns directly, everyone understood. They had become a quiet national legend, the triumph of mind over might. For Italy, the campaign left scars deeper than defeats. It showed that technological superiority could be undermined by creativity and courage. The wooden guns forced the Regia Aeronautica, one of Europe's proudest air forces, to confront the truth it was not built to understand, that power without understanding is blind. After the war, some Italian officers admitted a reluctant respect for their opponents. One wrote years later, "We had aircraft, they had imagination." In the end, imagination flew higher. The words carried more weight than he perhaps realized. Across the world, small nations struggling under colonial rule drew inspiration from Ethiopia, the only African nation to resist complete colonization. Its story became proof that dignity could survive invasion and that intellect could humble empire. The legend of the wooden guns grew into metaphor. Poets wrote of trees that stood against steel. Teachers told their students how their ancestors had turned the land itself into a weapon. The story became more than history. It became identity. A reminder that resistance is not always a matter of strength, but of imagination. In time, the world forgot the details. The names of commanders faded. The records yellowed. But the principle endured. Whenever Ethiopians faced hardship, famine, occupation, or political unrest, the story returned, carried like a torch through generations. Remember when our fathers fooled the sky. Even today, in rural villages, the phrase wooden gun sometimes appears in conversation. It means a clever trick, a small solution to a large problem, an acknowledgement that creativity is a kind of weapon too. Looking back now, it's easy to see the resonance. The same logic that fooled Mussolini's airmen lives on in the digital age. Camouflage, misinformation, and illusion remain cornerstones of conflict. Technology has evolved, but psychology has not. Every army still fears what it cannot see. Every empire still doubts what it cannot prove. Military historians who teach at academies in the United States, Britain, and Africa still reference the Ethiopian deception as one of the earliest case studies in psychological operations. Some even call it the wooden gun doctrine, a poetic phrase for a strategy that cost nothing but imagination. In a century defined by machines, the wooden guns remind us that intelligence, not industry, defines victory. If you travel today to the highlands near Debre Marcos or Lake Tana, the air is peaceful. The grass grows thick over the old ridges. Shepherds still lead their flocks where once the wooden gun stood. The mountains hold no monuments, only silence. Yet that silence is sacred. For those who know, every tree trunk feels like a memorial to ingenuity. Every echo of the wind a whisper of defiance. Sometimes, villagers still find fragments. A carved stump, blackened by time, shaped like a barrel. They pick it up, smile, and say quietly, "This fooled an empire." Then they toss it aside, because the real monument is not the wood, but a story, still alive, still told. The tale of the 12,000 Ethiopian patriots and their wooden guns is not merely about war. It is about the mind's refusal to accept defeat. It is about turning scarcity into strength and finding victory not in destruction, but in deception. The Italians had their planes, their bombs, their industry. The Ethiopians had patience, wit, and wood. And in that contest, between arrogance and imagination, imagination won. So when history remembers the great inventions of war, the tanks, the planes, the cannons, it should also remember the simplest of them all, a tree carved by hand that turned fear against those who sowed it. Because in the end, the most powerful weapon is not the one that fires, but the one that makes the enemy afraid to pull the trigger.